Welcome to Tanach Study and to Sefer Study. I'm Nachliel Selavan, and you are watching another episode of Archaeology Snapshot, and this time on Sefer Iyov, the book of Job, the book of Iyov, one of the Ketuvim, the writings, and what is called Sifrut HaChochma, wisdom literature. And it's a great plug for Yom Kippurim, because on Yom Kippur, as the Mishnah says in Yoma, one of the things that would be read to the Kohen Gadol to keep him engaged and to keep him awake all night is Sefer Iyov, because it's Dvarim HaMoshchim et HaLev, it's things which engage you and move you, and I really hope that we're going to achieve that here with this very unique perspective of archaeology on the book of Iyov. So in general, what we do, as you know, you've been in the game for a long time, is we discuss basically when is the story happening, who are the main players, where are the locations, with highlights from history and archaeology. When it comes to Iyov, we really need some sort of, I guess I can say, a wizard to kind of guide us on the yellow brick road to the land of Oz, Eretz Utz, the place where the story begins. So let's go and find the Wizard of Oz. I think we're going to be meeting Iyov and his friends. Wrong Oz. Sorry, wrong one. Let's restart. Okay, here's our map of the ancient Near East. Good. Ish haya be'eretz Utz ve'Iyov shmo. Iyov was a man who lived in the land of Utz, from where the name Oz comes from. Now, the Wizard of Oz, the translation in Hebrew, Eretz Utz, is of course very appropriate because we are talking about storms, Nifkeda Svivav Sa'ara, it's all these references to storm in nature, but no, seriously, not talking about hurricanes and tornadoes, but it's a miraculous kind of place. It's a magical kind of place. Does it really exist? Did it not exist? So let's talk about Iyov, and we'll see that there's a lot more than meets the eye. So what I'm going to do is talk about the name Iyov and the name of his main three friends. I'm not going to talk about Elihu, who just pops up in the middle of nowhere. I'm just going to talk about Iyov and his friend Eliphaz Temani, Bildad Shuchi, and Sofar Naamati. And what I'm going to try to do is to show references to their names and their origins, and to try to figure out if these people existed, where did they live, and what exactly is the backdrop of the story. And I'm going to take us all over the place with this, so please hold on tight. Let's get going. So first of all, the name Iyov. As we know, in general, in Tanach and in Chazal, Midrash does this as well, people's names aren't necessarily their birth names, but rather are names which refer to something about them in the story. We have this a lot in Divrei Hayamim, but we're going to hopefully get there. We basically have 6 more episodes until we finish. We are almost done, so this is really exciting. So I'm going to wait on the whole name topic to get to Divrei Hayamim. But the name Iyov, we don't find anything like it in all of Tanakh. In the story itself, there's that question of, is Iyov an oyev? Is he an enemy? And he actually says to God, are you mistaking me for an enemy? And there's this whole dialogue that goes back and forth. So there's this play on word, Iyov, Oyev. Okay. But in archaeology from ancient Mesopotamia, from the Middle Bronze Age, in other words, Tkufat HaAvot, and earlier, we've actually uncovered documents with the name Iyov in it. So we know that the name Iyov is a name that existed in the ancient Near East. But when exactly did he live? So first of all, Chazal, and this is primarily in the Gemara in Baba Batra, which talks about the canonization, the putting together of all of the books of Tanakh, which we're talking about authors of over a period of 1,000 years. I mean, we have the Torah, of course, but I'm saying Nevi'im from Yoshua all the way to the Persian period with Ezra and Nehemiah and Daniel and Esther. That's over 1,000 years of different authors in different periods. And there were books that were written afterwards that were not included in the Tanakh. And so the idea of the canonization, the canon, the writing of the Chavdalet Sfarim as one unit, as Tanakh, was done according to Chazal by Anshe Knesset HaGdolah. And the Gemara Baba Batra is always going to come up when discussing who wrote what book, what came when, in what order do you put it. Okay. So that Gemara in Baba Batra says there are 3 possibilities as to when Iyov existed, if he existed at all. Either he was in the time of the Meraglim, the times of Moshe, and in that case Moshe Rabbeinu would have written it, which is one of the opinions in the Gemara, or in the time of David HaMelech, or in the time of Esther. That's quite a range over there. One of the opinions is Iyov Mashal Haya. He was a Mashal. Now we just finished Mishle, so we can talk about the concept of Mishle again and say, well, he was a concept, he was an idea. Okay, let's put that idea on the shelf for a moment. We're going to take it back off the shelf very soon. But in that spirit, the Moreh Nevuchim, Rambam, actually says that the entire thing was metaphor, right? And he goes on and on about that. And there's, of course, a range of Chachamim commentators which discuss this. Let's first of all, delve a little bit into the story in order to answer these questions, in order to deal with it. So I'm going to mention a name of a place which we are going to get back to very soon. And that is a site in northern Syria called Ugarit, which is in Ras Samra. The excavations are called the excavation of Ras Samra. It's right over here in northern Syria. Why am I mentioning Ugarit or Ras Samra? Because Ugarit is the primary source for Canaanite documents which have a lot of stories which are very relevant to understanding Tanakh, and we're going to have a lot of fun with them in Sefer Iyov. So if you were the Kohen Gadol, this is a good way to keep you up at night, maybe even scare you too much from going back to sleep, as you're going to soon see. So stick on for that. We're going to get there very soon. Now, Ugarit is going to be an important place. I'm going to refer to it several times, but since this is the only time we're officially looking at the map, I wanted to put it there. So Ugarit's going to be an important source. Now, in the stories of Ugarit, we find stories of ancient Canaanite mythology, which is an adaptation of ancient Babylonian and Akkadian Sumerian mythology, which we've also found in Mesopotamia. So it's important to understand this literature, because the literature that has been found in Ugarit really shed so much light on Pshat and understanding what Tanakh is saying. I would like to share some of that excitement with you here in this episode on Sefer Iyov, and I hope that I do a good job and enough Job puns. So that's Ugarit. Now let's talk about Iyov. If you go through the first perek, the first chapter of Iyov, who lives in Eretz Utz, from the terrain, from the proximity to types of land and the types of animals that he has, you can presume that he's more or less in the area of the Bashan, in the area of the Golan Heights. Now, almost everything I'm going to say now is from the introduction to Iyov in Da'at Mikra, so you can always go and look it up in much more detail. But I'm going to give you the basic breakdown of the discussion. So let's start just playing the game of where does the name show up in Tanakh. So the name Utz shows up in the children of Nahor, et Utz Bechoro, ve'et Buz Achiv, ve'et Kemuel Avi Aram. Now these are either individual people and or tribes which became cities. So Aram, the discussion is it's either Aram Naharaim or Aram Damasek. And in that case, Utz is going to be somewhere in that area. Now, there's an area in the Bashan, which is on the road towards Damascus, towards Aram Damasek, which is called Dir Ayub. And you can look up Dir Ayub. It's an ancient tradition that is the place where Iyov lived. That is what Dir Ayub means in Arabic. It's the place where Iyov lived. Okay. Now, let's talk about his friends. Eliphaz Temani. Now, we are used to calling Teman Yemen, but Teman in Tanakh is actually in Edom. Sisi v'simchi bat Edom yoshevet be'eretz Utz. So there is a discussion on is Utz actually in Eretz Edom, which is also called Teman, or Temana because it's in the south. Teman also means south in Tanakh. And so Eliphaz would have been probably from that Teman, which is the southern area of Bnei Kedem. And we spoke about Chochmat Shlomo, Vaterev Chochmat Shlomo, Mikol Chochmat Bnei Kedem. We've spoken about the wisdom of the tribes of the east. In Mishle, I mentioned the far east, even though that's really not the same thing as Bnei Kedem, as we'll see from Shoftim and so on. We have Midian and Bnei Kedem and Ammon and Moab are all in the Transjordan and the eastern border of the Jordan in Iver HaYarden. So it doesn't really fit to call the ancient Near East or the Far East Chochmat Bnei Kedem, but I thought it would be associated in the context of wisdom from around the world in Mishle. Here we're going to be more specific. In terms of the name Eliphaz, this is really interesting. What does the word Eliphaz mean? So if you think about it, the word Paz means two different things in Tanakh. Paz can mean gold, like Zahav Mufaz, or like with Yosef, Vayafozu zero'ei yadav. It has to do with weakening of the strength of your arms. So Vayafozu zero'ei yadav has to do with strength. So Eliphaz means God has given me strength, or God is strong. Eliphaz, which is very interesting. Which is really interesting. Now, in the children of Ishmael, we have Yetur, Nafish, Vatema, and it is possible that this Teman is Tema from Bnei Ishmael, which means we are in the general area of Bnei Ishmael, which is in the desert, Transjordan, and going towards the Arabian Peninsula, towards Teman. So we are more or less in the area of the southern Jordan. Let's move on to his next friend, Bildad HaShuchi. So first of all, the name Bildad, there are various scholars who talk about the elements of the name Bildad, like Bil'am, the element Bel in the beginning of a name, and Bildad as Adad, Hadad. There's a conversation about that. and that would place him a little bit further north than we're going to place him. Who is Shuach? Hashuchi in Tanach. We find from the children of Keturah, et Yishbak ve'et Shuach. And these are the children which Avraham Avinu sent El Eretz Kedem. Where is Eretz Kedem? Well, Eretz Kedem spans from the Transjordan all the way to Aram, Naharaim referring to the area which is on the Prat and the Chidekel, the two Neharot, the two rivers, Aram Naharaim, which is further into Turkey. So, which is further into the Near East, closer to Syria and Turkey. Okay. So we have Shuach showing up relatively in that area, assuming it's a descendant of the children of Keturah. And we find that Shuach is from Bnei Kedem, Kedma, and in Sefer Shoftim we hear about Bnei Kedem being together with Midian, being together with Ammon, and being together with Moab. So this is what makes sense. Finally, Tzofar Na'amati. Who is Tzofar Na'amati? Well, first of all, the name Tzofar, we find nothing like it, just like all the other friends of Iyov. We just don't know where they come from. But the name Na'amati, there is a city called Na'ama in Yehoshua, and it's showing up in the land of Yehuda, in Shevet Yehuda, and it says, Vigderot bet Dagon v'Na'ama u'Makeda. So we have Na'ama, but it's very unlikely that that would be the Na'ama that his friend from far away would come from. So we have something which is called Shikul Otiyot. Letters are sometimes switched, so Na'ama, Ma'ona, and that happens a lot, and we're going to see that showing up in some really cool stuff really soon. And there are two places which are suggested to be the right place. So first of all, we have a place called Ma'anati, which is to the west of Nahar Prat, according to Professor Binyamin Mazal of Hebrew University. And then there is, interestingly, in Targum HaShiv'im, in the Septuagint, mentioning him as the king of the Minoans. Not the Minoans in Greece, but the Minoan, which is a powerful kingdom in today's Yemen, which is further south. So this is the range that we have. It's really cool to see that these are areas that we can at least have some sort of anchor to talk about. Let's go back to Ugarit. In Ugarit, we have stories of the kings, heroes, and mythologies. And the word mythology I use very, very carefully to refer to mythical, magical stories from the ancient world, which explain the origins of the world, how it was formed, and they have all these flood stories and so on. And in these stories, we have the mention of a person named Daniel, who was a hero from the ancient Near East. And there's a pasuk in Yechezkel which mentions Noach, Iyov, and Daniel together. If you think about when Daniel lived in the Persian period, and you think about the fact that Daniel was, if not a contemporary, shortly after him, the likelihood of people in Bavel knowing Daniel's name to that extent where you can talk about Noach, Iyov, Daniel is very unlikely, and Dat Mikra indeed brings this opinion. So it might actually be Daniel, and if you'll notice how it's spelled Dalid Nun Aleph Lamed without a Yud. So he was a legend who is known from the ancient Near East, as was Iyov. Iyov may have existed as a person. He may have not existed. It's very possible, as Chachamim say, that it was a mashal, Iyov mashal haya, but he was the proverbial, and I don't mean proverbs, he was the proverbial ish tzaddik, and so we put onto him this conversation about understanding the world and morality and how HaKadosh Baruch Hu acts in the world. We put it on him, we pin it on him, and write a story of, had the story happen, of course, even though it probably didn't, but this is the characters involved. And so the characters themselves are anchored in very ancient Near Eastern stories, legends of people who were famous in the ancient Near East. And so when we go to these stories, you have to understand that Noach, for example, is in the context of people knowing about flood stories. We have Artahasis, we have Gilgamesh, right? And then we have Torah's exposition of it, Torah recontextualizing these stories. So we have Noach, Iyov, and Daniel, which are characters or stories or themes, ideas that are ancient stories that are rooted in the ancient Near East. And so it's very important to know of the Ugaritic stories and to get into the conversation to better understand what people at the time understood and took for granted. And sometimes Tanakh is actually sort of arguing with these things and giving them a different moral gloss, a different context, and rephrasing them. And it's important to understand them just to read simple psukim and know what is going on, as we're going to see very soon, in a place that is a little bit off the map. And as we say, when something is off the map,
because maps used to say there'd be dragons here, but that don't mean the dragons aren't there.
So let's go and see some monsters. I love this part. I've been waiting for such a long time to talk about these monsters and dragons and sea serpents. Why am I talking about this? In the long conversations in Sefer Iyov, there's a part in Perek Chavav where HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives this entire sermon to Iyov about the foundation and formation of the earth. Were you there when the earth was formed? Do you have any idea what's involved in this? Do you really think you get the big picture? That you have the higher moral ground just because you are suffering, you poor little thing, or whatever the message to humanity is, to Klal Yisrael? I mean, this is some serious, deep, earth-shattering conversations. And in that conversation, Hashem says to Iyov, Berucho shamayim shifra cholela yado nachash bariach. What on earth is nachash bariach? Now, in Israel, you might know Rav Bariach, the word Bariach meaning a lock, something that brings things together, locks it, strengthens it. So you can say the serpent that coils itself around the world, something like that. And I'm going to show you what I mean exactly. There's some really cool stuff from Mesopotamia, but I want to show you a hidush in Pishat. In other words, a simple explanation of the text, which will blow your mind. So hold on tight. We see this Nachash Bariach showing up in several places in different names, but most famously, and ancient Near Eastern scholars know this stuff, especially scholars who study Ugaritic know this stuff cold. In Yeshayahu, Bayomo Yifkod Hashem Becharbo HaKasha VeHaGdola VeHazaka. It's on that day God will deliver punishment with His mighty and powerful sword upon Livyatan Nachash Bariach VeLivyatan Nachash Akalaton VeHarag et HaTanin Asher Bayam. So God will smite and destroy this Leviathan, which in modern Hebrew, the Leviathan is a whale, which is actually a mammal, not a serpent. So there's a lot of discussion about that. I'm going to give you some really great references very soon. And here's this Leviathan Nachash Bariach and Leviathan Nachash Akalaton. And Akalaton comes from like Ikulim, in other words, coiling around something. And then we have the Tanin Asher Bayam. And Chazal talk about this in the Gemara, the whole Gemara about the male and female Taninim, the Taninim Agdolim of the fifth day of creation. This is some serious stuff. And I say this with a lot of caution. I want you to understand that the place I'm coming from is from a place of Yirat Shamayim and tremendous respect towards Chazal, towards Chachamim, with a keen eye on the importance of studying Tanakh through a lens of the ancient Near East to better understand what's going on. So with that introduction, I want to take you on a very fascinating journey that almost knocked me off my chair today. And I'm going to give you the basic highlight points. And of course, I'm going to give you some cool references later. And this is all because of an article mentioned in a footnote in Da'at Mikra. It's incredible. So let's talk about Leviathans. There be monsters. There's a great book by the Zoo Rabbi himself, Rabbi Dr. Natan Slifkin. At the time he wrote this book, he was Rabbi Natan Slifkin. Now he's Natan Slifkin, and he has the magnificent Biblical Museum of Natural History in Beit Shemesh. They just moved into their new building. I'm going to link to that in the description. Please go visit the museum as soon as you can. I haven't gone yet, but Bili Neder, right before Yom Kippur, we just did Hatarat Nedarim. I'm not going to make a Neder right now, but I have not visited yet, and I really got to go. So Bili Neder, this is going to be on my list for this year. This book, Sacred Monsters, has an entire chapter on the Leviathan and monsters, and he gets into the discussion of understanding what is the Leviathan, what is the Tanin, what is the monster. He goes into etymology, and he tries to make a consistent argument of what the animal is throughout Tanakh. He talks about mammals versus reptiles, locations in the world, different discussions in Chazal and later commentators on it, but he does not talk about the ancient Near East. I'm going to link to this book in the description. Of course, I'm hoping that you hit the like button by now. I didn't even say it. I forget to say it, but my assumption is you've been with me this long, you know. So just take a second and please hit the thumbs up like button for the YouTube algorithm so that YouTube will know to suggest this video to people like you who will love this video. Moving on. So in the ancient Near East, we have these boundary stones, as we thought they were at least, called kuduru in Babylon. it's probably more likely that they were in temples, but they have lists of all kinds of debts and ownerships and things like that. But what they have on them are pictures which have to do with the Babylonian stories of creation and depiction of the world with its various layers from the depths all the way to the heavens. And I want to show you, not this one from the British Museum, which is really cool. It has dragons and lightnings and all these cool things on it. But I want to show you up close two sides of one kuduru, which is found at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Look carefully. On the right, you have the city of Babylon, perhaps. You have the Mushu dragon of Marduk, and I'm going to show you that dragon very soon again. It's a composite of eagle and serpent with horns. And on the left, we have what looks like a goat's head. That's going to be very important soon. And in the heavens, we have the sun and the moon, Shamash and Ishtar, the sun and the moon. It's a great conversation to have when you go into mythology, because there's a lot more than that meets the eye when you talk about understanding Tanakh. I mean, for example, Bet Shemesh may be named after an ancient pagan worship of the sun god Shamash, just like Yerecho is probably the moon god Yerech, and there's a lot more than that. So it's important to be aware of these things, but I want to focus specifically on these dragons to bring us to understand what is Livyatan Nachash Bariach, Livyatan Nachash Akalaton. What are these mythical leviathans that for some reason are involved in the creation and formation of the world and show up in creation, and for some reason Yeshayahu bothers to tell you that God has to fight them. What are we talking about? Here is our Mushu dragon from the Ishtar Gate of Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. And if you've seen the dragon in Mulan, then you'll know that his name is Mushu. Is there a connection? I'm going to leave that for you to find out. But here's also a cylinder seal. In other words, the impression of a seal that you can roll out. And it shows you the dragon of chaos from the Babylonian creation story called Enuma Elish, which means up there. It's just how they begin the story. And it talks about Tiamat, the dragon of the Tehom. Tehom and Tiamat are very etymologically similar, and that's not for no reason. And we have this dragon which coils itself around the world. And if you notice carefully in that kuduru, you'll see that there is a coiled dragon around the heavens. And this is part of the vision of the ancients of the world, which is deeply involved with serpents and dragons and snakes. What does this have to do with Nachash Bariach Akalaton and Iyov? I want to share with you something that will knock your socks off. Remember we spoke about Ugarit? So in Ugarit, we find these stories which talk about these two sea monsters, these two sea dragons or serpents, which are part of the creation story, which we also find in Babylon and we find in Sumer, and which made its way all the way into the Odyssey in Greek mythology. And there are scholars who discuss this. This is from the article that I read by Daniel Lieber, which was mentioned in a footnote in Da'at Mikra. So we have these two monsters. One of them is a six-headed monster. We have Charybdis with the six-headed monster which pulls sailors off the boat. And we have Schila or Skila. Those names, remember I spoke about Shikulotiyot, about the swapping of letters? I'm going to really simplify this, but I'm happy to reference to you this amazing article. Those two monsters are a reincarnation of the Ugaritic story of two serpents. And in Ugaritic, they are called Latan Batan Barach, sounds like Livyatan Nachash Bariach, and Latan, like Livyatan, Latan Batan Akaltan, Livyatan Nachash Akalaton. We find these two characters in Ugarit. And there's a linguistic discussion that shows you how Bariach becomes Charybdis. Barichdis, Charybdis, we just swap the letters, Nachash Bariach. And then we have Akalaton. Now, the Hebrew for scorpion is Akrav, but the Akrav is Sakrav, Sakri, Scorpion. So you take that Skila, Akira, Akalaton. You see what I did there? Now, I'm really oversimplifying this whole linguistic discussion about how the Ugaritic story, which is an ancient story of these Livyatan Nachash Bariach, Livyatan Nachash Akalaton, made their way into the Odyssey. But it gets wilder, because somehow this has something to do with Yom Kippur in a way which you would have no way of guessing it's coming, and I only mean this by an association and as a segue into talking about goats. Not the Seir L'Azazel, but just a goat. How do you say goat in Aramaic? Let's put that on the side for a moment. This incense bowl found in ancient Beit Shemesh, and we already mentioned Beit Shemesh, so this is found in ancient Beit Shemesh. According to the interpretation of Daniel Lieber, who wrote this article, is a serpent with the head of a goat. Others will say it's just decorative, but the serpent with the head of a goat shows up in Ugarit, and I showed it to you as a goat's head in that serpentine story on the Kudur from ancient Babylon, as you can see here in this picture. The goat-headed serpent. How do you say goat in Aramaic? Barcha. Nachash bariach. Nachash barach, nachash bariach. This is the ancient Aramaic or Syrian. Nachash bariach, the goat-headed serpent of ancient mythology, made its way into Tanakh in the sense of people thinking that this is how the world was formed. So Tanakh is going to take that, Iyov is going to take that to have a conversation which speaks to people in terms they can understand, to talk about who do you think really did this stuff. Not, Marduk and Inanna and Iya and Apsu and all those. None of that stuff. None of that shows up in Tanakh. But it's still in conversation with what people took for granted. And you can even see remnants of this. I just want to read to you from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, who says that on the fifth day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created Leviathan Nachash Bariach, etc., etc. Uben Snapirav, and between his scales, HaBariach Shel Haaretz Omed, the lock of the world, what pulls the world together, stands between his scales. In other words, in the time of Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, we're talking about almost 1,000 years ago, people forgot what Nachash Bariach actually meant. But there's a remnant what it actually meant with Ezra HaBavli, who in his poem writes, and I quote, Timale groni me'izei berechecha, or berachecha, or berichecha. Fill up my throat with your goats. In other words, feed me well. Give me a nice, good bobby. That means barbecue, just so you know. We're not talking about the plastic, So, Izei barachecha or berichecha, because barcha is an ez. So Nachash bariach and Nachash kalaton are these two mythological creatures which are part of the creation stories that everybody grew up on at the time, and Iyov is saying something about them. But speaking about the creation of the world, I want to end up with one beautiful concept, which I made a short video about in the American Museum of Natural History, and I'm going to link to that video in the description, so please watch the video, please hit like, feel free to comment. I'd love to hear what you think about this. That has to do with the creation of the world. Again, this is part of the conversation with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which God is having with Iyov. And that surprisingly has to do with Makom HaMikdash and with Yom Kippur and Sefer Yonah. So the pasuk says as follows: Notet Safon al Tohu. God basically places the north on the deeps. Tole Eretz al Belima. First of all, Tzafon in Ugaritic is a reference to the mountains north of Ugarit, and that has to do a lot with their deity Baal, who we know is worshipped by the Knaanim, and Am Yisrael worshipped the Baal and the Asherah in the time of the Shoftim. It was terrible, right? But Tzafon, Har Tzion Yarkete Tzafon, there is a conversation about how that Tzafon relates to Ugarit and what this is cool stuff, okay? I'm not getting into that now. I want to talk about Hole Eretz Al Belima, which is in some of the Piyutim of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Let's talk about the earth. So, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to you as follows: Mi yisaper shchakim b'chokhmah. Who can even begin to talk about the formation of the heavens? V'nivle shamayim mi yashkiv. I mean, it's endless. Betzeket afar lamusak uregavim yedubaku. As the clumps of earth are pulled together by gravity, basically, to become the planet. This, in technical terms, is called the accretion of the planet, when the planet starts having enough of a mass to pull its weight together to become the earth. And Chazal say an incredible thing about this. Chazal say in the Gemara, and I mentioned this in my video, that the Even HaShetiyah, which according to the Midrash in Yonah, the Leviathan shows Yonah, and we read this on Yom Kippur. He shows Yonah the Even Shemimena Hushtat HaOlam, the foundation stone of the planet. And Chazal say that is the Kodesh HaKodashim, in the Holy of Holies. Think how incredible an idea it is to have the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKodashim, the place that the Kohen Gadol goes to on Yom Kippur once a year. And what is the significance of that geographic location? And it doesn't really matter if you can figure this out geographically, geologically, or not. The point is the concept. That the concept is that is Even HaShetiyah, that is the place from where the planet was formed. The awareness of what it means to be a human being on this planet, not having these statues and gods and goddesses with all of their crazy stories of fighting each other and ripping each other and creating monsters and all this crazy stuff that's going on. No, the formation of the planet, the forming of the planet, so that you can be a conscious human being and be part of this story. This is an incredible introduction to Yom Kippur as well. And so I wish all of you a Gmar Chatima Tova, as well as a Chag Sameach, and I'm looking forward to see you in the next episode of Kohelet, right in time for Chag HaSukkot Haba Aleinu L'Tova. Please make sure to like, to subscribe, to share this video, to tell people about it, and I will see you on the other side.